Welcome back to the Docker command line options section of the Getting Started with Docker course. In this lesson, we'll be covering the run command on the command line. So let's go to the command line and look at the different options for Docker run. So right now we have done the basics of Docker run, but we want to expand on that a little bit and talk through the various options. And there's a lot of options on the Docker run command. And I won't cover them all because some of them are quite obscure and only apply to certain circumstances or certain situations that you might come across in a more advanced setting. I'm going to cover the ones that you'll use most often. So let's start off with some port mapping. Now remember, we have two ports. We have port 80 for our web traffic and also port 443. So we can map both of those using our -p command. And then we can give them specific ports. So we can say that port 4080 on our machine, on the full machine we were running, maps over to port 80 on our Docker container. So that's the first one. The second one is -p again to map port, let's go with 4443, maps over to port 443 on our container. Okay, so the first number is the port on our machine. What number do I choose? I get a choice. I can do whatever I want. The best practice here is probably to choose something in the 1000 or higher port range, but you have to limit it to, I believe, 65,000 or so. So don't go too high. But the 1,000 and above is probably good. In this case, typically what people do is they add an extra number or two in front. So maybe instead of port 80, it's 8,000, or maybe it's 8080. Okay, those are some pretty common ones. I chose 4080. Why? Because, it doesn't really matter. Okay, so but you get to choose, and notice I'm mapping one port, two ports. And how you know which ports to map? Well, the Docker file tells you. And also you can look in the image as well to see what ports are in the exposed list. Remember that just because it's in the Docker files exposed doesn't mean it actually does anything on your machine. That's just there to say these are the ports that will be available. All right, so that's the first one, is the ports. The next one is, what if you want to attach a volume? Now, earlier we talked about volumes in the Docker file, and we said that we can't give them a location on our machine specifically. And so Docker creates that temp folder for us to attach the volume to. Well, in the command line, we can specify, because in the Docker file, we don't know which machine that Docker file will be built on. But in the run command, or on the command line, we're running it for this particular machine. Therefore, we can specify an actual path. So let's do that. I'm going to do a -v for volume. I'm going to say c:/temp/docker/ That's the location where I want the volume to be located on my machine. Just like over here, my machine first and the container. So my machine comes first, and then afterwards we say colon, and then the path where it should end up on the container. So I'm going to say /root/docker, and this will create that folder if it doesn't already exist on the container. So this maps a physical location on my machine to a location in the container. If the container writes to that location, it's actually writing to my machine. This allows you to have multiple containers maybe that are writing to that same location, or better yet, to have something like a database server in your container where the actual server lives in the container, but the files that it builds off, the actual database files, live on your machine. Therefore, you can kind of preserve that even if you rebuild the container with a newer version of SQL or whatever. Okay, so here I have my path, which is Docker, and then we have the path on the machine, which is /root/Docker. Okay, so that's a volume. The next command is -e, and that allows you to set environmental variables. Okay, so in our Docker file, we had that environment variable option to specify, okay, here's the variables for each of these things. We can either override them in here, or we can create our new environmental variables. So for example, I could just say test var, which would be the variable itself, which there isn't one currently called test var. I could say equals and then give it a number or a name or a value of some type. This allows you to set variables in your container from the command line. How that's useful is it allows you to pass information in or set information up or reset information that the container then uses to identify certain values. For example, when you build a .NET Core web application and you want to use HTTPS, you can't just say, okay, here's the port, just use it, because there's no certificate. And because there is that the ASP.NET doesn't know what the HTTPS port is. Well, that's an environmental variable you can set and then point to. So you can set the ASP.NET Core _HTTPS _ port equal to, for example, this port right here. And then it knows, okay, that's the port to go to, because we have a redirect in ASP.NET Core where it redirects from the HTTP port, which is typically port 80, to the HTTPS port, which is typically 443. But in our case, on our machine, it's going to be 4080 and 4443. And so it allows the container to know what that variable is so it can redirect correctly. Now you still have to deal with the certificate, and that's a different area, and we'll probably cover that later. But at least that part of it isn't too difficult. You just change the environmental variable. Okay, so that we're going to set up a new variable called test var, and the value will be 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, an important thing to do is to -- name your container. So let's call this container new - container. So that names our container something. Now, if you don't give it a name, then Docker will give it a name for you, which can be weird. It's definitely not descriptive. Okay, next is a couple different options, and one is -d, one is -i, and one is -t. So it's 3 different options, and you may see it sometimes as -dit or -itd. What this is, and it's actually technically 3 different commands, and you don't have to run all of them, but let's talk through each one. The first one is -d, and that allows you to run disconnected. What it means is it will detach this window, this current PowerShell window I'm in right now. It'll detach it from the container. It'll run the container in the background instead of the foreground. So if I run in the foreground, I can see how the container is interacting and see what's happening in the container, those type of things. But I then can't go and look at the Docker information because I have to open a new window because this window is currently being taken up by the foreground operations. So if you want to run the background normally, you do -d. The next one is So let's look at what those circumstances are. So the first one, and this is an option for the restart, is on failure. So on failure, and let's kind of shrink this down just a little bit to give us more room on the screen. There we go. So now dash dash restart equals on dash failure. Also notice all lowercase. Casing is actually pretty important in these commands, so be careful of your casing, otherwise you might have a problem. Okay, so on failure, and you can specify if you want to, colon, and the max number of retries. So if a container fails, it crashes for whatever reason, you can say try to restart if that failure happens. Now, failure means something that was unexpected, meaning there was some type of issue that caused the container to crash unexpectedly. In .NET terms, that might be an unhandled exception. Whatever it is, the container shouldn't have stopped, but it did. That'd be an on failure. So in this case, we're going to restart if we have an on failure event, but the optional colon and the number specifies how many times we retry. So if it fails, and then it tries to restart and it fails again, we'll try that 5 times, that restart. After the 5th time, it's going to say, you know what? No, there's a problem here. We want to stop. That max retries, it's pretty important, because otherwise what happens is if you have a buggy container, you might be starting it over and over and over and over and over again and just filling your logs with all the restart messages and the error messages, and it's just never going to work. So I would recommend that you limit your on failure retries. Now the other options are unless stopped. So if the container is stopped for any other reason besides you manually stopped it, it'll try and restart. And then we have this option, which is always. So always is, it always tries to restart, even if you manually stop it. Now, that's a little misleading, because even though it says it'll always restart, if you go to the command line and stop your container, it will not restart right away. It'll restart when Docker recycles. So the next time you restart Docker, it will try to start your container again. It will not start it immediately after you say Docker stop and your container ID. So just note that it's not this magic thing where it's always going to keep going even if you tell it to stop. So always, like I said, a little bit of a misnomer, but that's an option. Now, I'm not going to simulate crashing our container or restarting Docker, but just know that this command, this -- restart, is available. But instead, I'm going to do a different command, which is --rm. Now, I can't run the restart option with this --rm because it causes a conflict, especially in the always flag. But really at any point, because this --rm stands for the idea of removing your container when you stop the container. For whatever reason, if it crashes or whether you stop it manually, the container goes away when you stop it. This is typically used in development circumstances where you're just trying something out, but you don't want to clog up your inventory of stopped containers with all of your different attempts. So what you do is you do a --rm, or --rm, and it will remove your container once you stop it. Okay, or once it's stopped, either way. So we're going to leave that on instead of the restart policy. So --rm. The next one you may or may not need, but I want to point it out, and that's the -h for host name. This allows you to specify basically the computer name, the host name, for your container. So let's just call it my host name so you can easily identify it later as, oh, yep, that was the host name we gave it. So my host name. So this is used specifically for networking between containers because you can reference based off the IP address or based off the host name. So those are the commands that I find that are most often used. You do have a couple more. For example, you have the -- label, where you can label something and give it, this is Tim's container. So again, that's metadata, just like with the image. It doesn't actually affect how the container runs. It just says that yes, this value is attached to the image, kind of like a branding or whatever else you want to do. So that's one. The other is, this is one that's interesting. Right up here, we specified -p, lowercase p. That's important. And the port we want to map. We did it twice. But instead, you could have done -uppercase p. And what that will do is it will specify map whatever ports are exposed to random ports on this host. So it's a quick way of mapping these out without having to specify the port themselves. But usually that's only used for development purposes because otherwise you want to know specifically, or you want to specify specifically, these are the ports to map. So just note that's an option as well. Other than that, for the most part, the rest of the things are there for more off the beaten path type options. They're not the most common ones. I will link to the documentation for this so you can read through the other options as needed. The last thing to do, the thing you can't forget, and again, I forget this, is you get so caught up in all your different flags that you forget to actually put in the image name. New-image, and it's the latest, I believe. So that's the image to build this container off of. So don't forget that. Technically, the run command takes one argument, and that is the image to build. Now you have the flags that are available, but those aren't arguments. They're a little bit different. All right, so with that being said, one last thing. This :latest, you don't have to specify :latest if you want the latest and if the image has the latest tag. However, if it doesn't have the latest tag, or you have a need for a different image, meaning maybe you want the 1.0.0 instead of the 1.0.1, then you must specify. So unless you are expecting and it's available the :latest, you need to make sure that you specify the tag at the end. In this case, I'm going to be explicit and say I want the latest. Let's run this. All right, so now notice the HTTP-D foreground. That's because I did not do the -D wanted to have that interactive terminal on my container. Well, there is still a way of doing it after the fact, and that is the docker exec command. So let's run that. So docker exec -it for interactive terminal, and then give it the container name. So A8C, which is that's the start of the ID, or you could have said new-container. And then we pass in, what do you want to execute on your machine? Well, I want to execute bash. So it's going to execute bash on the container. If I hit enter, now you see bash -4.4 pound. What it's saying is, I'm now running bash on the container, and that's I've taken over your terminal. So if I were to say ls for list files, it says index.html. Well, let's do ls/, which should take me to the root. And now notice it's hard to read maybe with a contrast here, but let's highlight. Oh, that doesn't do much better. We have a bunch of different folder structure here, including one that says root. So if I were to say actually cd/root, remember that it was actually /root/docker. They mapped over to be our volume. So if I hit enter here and then I do an ls again, it says HTML is the only folder in that location, the root/docker. Let's move up my Explorer and notice ctemp docker had just one folder called HTML. But if I right click and say new text document, let's call it test.txt, and then I come back over here and I say ls again on that same folder, I now get text or test.txt and my HTML folder. So by doing that, I've demonstrated that this is on the container, this command prompt here, and yet I can see what's going on in this folder because this is the volume that this container uses. So now I can just say exit to exit the terminal, and notice I'm back to PowerShell, I'm back to ctemp docker. So now if I were to hit dir, I can see that yes, I have that test.txt, and that's my current directory. Now, docker ps, I don't have to do -a because it's currently running, but I can do -a again so I can compare the list, and of course there's just the one either way because we don't have any stopped containers. So this container right here is running. It's been up for 6 minutes, and we're done with it. We don't need it anymore. So if I were to hit docker stop and give it the new -container or the A8C, either way, because A8C is the ID of the container, either way, it's going to stop this container. And it just gives me the new -container to say, yes, it stopped that container. Now, if I do docker ps-a, there's nothing in the list. There's not even a stopped container. And the reason why is because I ran that --rm when I built the container. And I said, remove this container once it's stopped. When I stopped it, it also removed it. So that's an overview of the basic commands. Like I said before, if you go to documentation, there's a whole host of well, you can change that at the run command. Pretty much, if you can set it in the Docker file for building, you can change it here at the run command. However, I've found that the less you do in the run command, the better, just because you hate to have to remember this whole long sequence. Now, some things you have to. Volumes, if you want to map a specific location, you have to do that at the command prompt. You can't do that in your Docker file. Setting environmental variables per machine, or anything else that's per machine, you pretty much have to do in the command line. But if you can avoid some of these things, that's great. Because there's an awful lot of options here that could be set in the Docker file and probably should be. Okay? So I'll give you this link, but it's doc.docker.com/engine/reference/command line/run. So that's the location to get it. In fact, if you did just /command line without the /run, you'll get all these different references. You can look them up yourself. And I'll give you that link as well. But I just pull up the run command here so you can see all the different options. And quite frankly, so I could make sure that I was getting the right information, because it's hard to remember all this information. Again, another reason why keep it simple, keep it short, and keep it to just the things you're actually going to use. Oh, one more thing. Let's actually rebuild this container. I wanted to show you, I did it interactive. Oh well. So now I have Docker PS, I have this 932 container. If I do Docker info on 932, nope, that's not the one. Docker inspect 932. There we go. This is a whole bunch of information about your container. Okay, so from the ID, set 932, there's the whole ID, when it was created, what the path is, the status of it, and then a whole bunch of information about what's running on it currently. Okay, this is where you can find out more information about, for example, it mounted from the host, the ctemp docker location, it mounted to /root/docker. It's mapping the port 443 to the host port of 4443, and again, port 80 to host port 4080. There's a lot of information you can find out here. It's probably more than you need, but when you're not quite sure where it is, sometimes it's easiest to pop this open and read through the entire thing. So Docker inspect, and then the container name or ID. And then down here under there is one for, well, there's our mounting again, but then there's host name, and it's my host name. So we have that's the host name we gave it instead of it being generated automatically. There's also environmental variables here, env, and there's our test var equals 1, 2, 3, 4. So I want to show you that to show you, yes, we actually did apply our test variable. Notice also there's a path variable, there's an HTTPD prefix, there's an HTTPD version, the SHA-256, the patches, and the Apache dist URLs. So we could actually overwrite those if we wanted to. For example, we could overwrite the path variable and add our own locations on that path. So just note those are available to you, and also that yes, we did in fact add our own environmental variable that then anything on this container can then access that value of 1, 2, 3, 4 if they look for the environmental variable of test var. Okay? And oh, there's a label. So this is Tim's container. Dibs. Okay? So just want to show you that. That's the Docker inspect command. So Docker inspect, and then the ID or number, or the ID or the name of the container. And with that, I'm also going to do a Docker. Let's do a Docker stop 932 and Docker ps-a to show that yes, all our containers are stopped, and Docker images just to show us that's what our current image list looks like. Okay? Now that we're done with the Docker run command, we're going to look at how to manage our containers next. So definitely come back for that.